Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the 7.62 AKs because many things have changed in 12.9. Some things are the same as always, but the AKM is no longer the king of this category in my opinion. So stick around and I'll show you why. Alright, so this is going to be pretty much a complete refresh on the 7.62 AKs. Now I've talked about some of these components before, but what I really wanted to do is go back to basics on everything and start from scratch and put kind of everything together for 12.9 so everything's relevant and up to date. I mean, the first thing that you're going to notice is that I use the flea market a lot, and I use the flea market link search to navigate around to look at various different bits and pieces. So that's really the first thing. So normally I end up finishing with ammo, and this time I'm going to change it up a little bit and begin with bullets. So what I would usually do if I'm going to look for like any particular category of ammo for a particular series of weapons is I'll find a gun, any gun. So we'll just use the AKM for example here. We'll use any gun that takes the ammo that we're looking for, right click on it and do linked search. Delete your search out of here and go into ammo. So now this is all of the rounds that are compatible with this particular weapon that this weapon fires. There's only really 3 rounds for the 7.62 AKs in my opinion. There's 2 which aren't really used at all. So if you see here, there's this US ammo, which is subsonic. This is just not really very good. It doesn't have very good penetration and it arcs like a paintball, a bit like the VSS does, but just without any of the actual performance. So no one really uses these. They don't really spawn. Scavs don't use them or anything, so no one ever uses US rounds, to be honest. Same with HP. So the hollow points, no one's really going to be doing leg meta with this. The prevalence of armor in EFT pretty much makes hollow points useless until they bring in something that's going to change the system. They're saying they're going to add armor plates to EFT so that you can shoot between the plates and you're not just, invulnerable all over when you're wearing good armor. Until that comes in, these are not going to be useful. Normally these are only good if you're using high fire rate weapons and you're shooting at legs and arms, and normally that's down to the SMGs. Something like the Vector for ACP is a perfect example of that, but the low fire rate of the AK is just not really going to be very useful. So no one really uses these either. So US and HP are basically out. Then the first round that you actually do see is the T45. This is the scav round that they added. All scavs used to use PS back in the day, but now they use this T45, which is kind of the cheap, crappy go-to and is a traitor. It's actually not that bad. It's very similar to PS in terms of performance. I think it's just very slightly less on pen, and that's about it, but it's very, very similar. PS is pretty much the staple. This is the default round for the AKs. PS is honestly one of the best value bullets in the entire game. This can be used early wipe to great effect and can be used right up until kind of the middle of the wipe, until everybody's running level 4 and 5 plus. It's actually very, very good. So against level 3 and even against level 4, it'll be okay as long as you get off a few decent shots. And as you can see, people selling it down to 70 rubles or something per round is extremely good for its price. Then the only other round that you actually have for 7.62 is BP. Now, BP's alright. It's quite expensive. You see it's like 900 per shot, but with the low fire rate of the AKM, it's not as bad as it is using like 995 out of an M4 or something, or like the new 7 and 31 out of the Vector, which is just crazy. This bullet is actually pretty good. Now, this will start to struggle against level 6. It'll 50% pen very roughly on level 5 armor on the first shot, so it's not perfect. It's no M995. I think the one unfortunate thing about the 7.62 category is that there isn't another bullet higher than this that you could use to really amp up your builds and turn it into the full proper meta. This is really why you don't see many players using the AKM at the top end, especially against other top players, just because if people are wearing level 6 armor or level 5 armor, you could get unlucky and end up they're absorbing 1 or 2 shots and you end up getting killed because they can get 3 clean shots on thorax with like BS ammo, Igolnik, or something like M995. So I think that's really why you don't see the AKMs really used at the top level, but a lot of people use them to great effect and can definitely kill players. I mean, lots of people have great success with it, so there's really nothing to stop you from running it at all. Next up, I want to go and look at what guns are actually going to use this. So again, using the linked search, we're going to go right-click linked search. So if you link search on a piece of ammo and then go into weapons, this will show you all of the weapons that will use that ammo. So we've got the assault carbines here, which we're not going to touch on, the 2 versions of the SKS and the VEP AKM. This thing is really just a semi-auto AKM. Pretty much all of the modding that we're going to talk about will work for this. If it works for the AKM, it'll pretty much work for this gun too. So just bear that in mind, but I'm not specifically going to look at this one, given that it's only semi. Then in terms of the actual assault rifles, we've got this list here. I'm not going to go through every other type of AK, I'm just going to focus on these 7.62 versions here. But we've got the AK-103 and the AK-104, which are part of the AK-100 series of weapons, but put in this caliber for 7.62. Now the 103 is really the AKM equivalent for the 100. So what the AK-103 really is a AK-74 but chambered in 7.62, pretty much. Now this is going to be the more modern version, and in the past, this one actually used to not be as good as the AKM. Now, this is what some of the balance changes in 12.9 have been about, is about kind of closing that gap between the AK-103 and the AKM. The AKM used to be meta because of some of the stocks it could take. AK-103 can only take this folding stock. But before we go too much into detail, let's just have a quick overview of all of these. So the AK-103 is a full-length AK assault rifle in 7.62, and it's very similar to the AKM, but a modernized version. You have the AK-104, which is effectively the same thing, but a shortened version. So what you can expect to see here is a little bit more ergonomics and a little bit more recoil to compensate for that. Then you have the AKM itself, which is kind of the old, the staple. It's got fixed stock. The AKM-N is the same as the AKM, except it has this dovetail mount here. The AKM-S has got folding stock, which is not replaceable, so this is why this one is usually cheaper. And the AKM-SN, which again, following the same pattern, the N means you've got this scope mounting port on the back, this dovetail mount, but you've still also got this folding stock here. So to note here, in terms of which ones actually have the dovetail, it's only the AKM and the AKM-S that don't have this dovetail mounting platform. So the 103, all of the 100 series have it, so the 103 and the 104 have it. The N, AKM-N and the AKM-SN both have it as well, because that's what the N signifies. So it's really only the AKM-S and the AKM that don't have this. Now, in terms of the cheapness of these different guns, the AKM-S, you would imagine, should always be the cheapest out of these. It has the least number of features, and by that I mean it doesn't have the mounting port for scopes, so that limits some of your options, and it also doesn't have the option to take any other stocks at all either. And so because of this, an AKM-S is never going to be a meta weapon because you can't replace the stock, and you're also forced to mount optics in very particular ways. You can't just use the dovetail. And so this will usually be the cheapest one, pretty much just because of these lack of options. Now, if we have a click through some of the others, what you would imagine in terms of the way that these get done, because the 103 is the most modern, you would think that this should probably be the most expensive. Now, this isn't always the case. The AKM-N typically ends up being quite expensive, so with Prapor actually, they're about the same price. Now, one interesting thing about this is that the 103 and the 104, generally, you will find that they are cheaper than the AKM-N, S, SN, and AKM base, simply because these 4 guns can be used for the Punisher questline, which is a slight strange thing. So the quest drives these guns to be a bit more expensive. There's also a trade for the AKM. There's one other thing to note, which is here, which is 3 Tushonkers for an AKM. Now, it really depends on when you look. The prices change on this all the time. But if we go and have a look at this, the Calabeef Stew, you see the bottom one here is 10k. If you've got 3 of those, then effectively you're going to end up being able to buy an AKM for 30k instead of, well, whatever they're going for on the flea market, which at the moment is about 40k. So you can save about 10k if you manage to nab some Tushonka cans and use that for the trade instead. So that's quite decent. But in theory, the AK-103 should be the most expensive out of these because it has really all the features. It's easy to mod, and we're going to get into some of the more modding details later. And it has this mounting port as well, and it's full length, so it has the lowest recoil of the AK-103 and the AK-104. Now, the next thing that I want to touch on is how you actually mount scopes to these. This is one thing that people forget sometimes about what's the easiest and cheapest way to mount various optics to these weapons. So we're going to jump into the preset for the AK-103 just as an example. So if you're going to be mounting red dots, reflex sights, holographics to the AK series, the easiest way to do this is this rear sight here. You want to replace this with a Tactica 2 TT01 rear sight weaver adapter. This will be from Prapor 2. So you grab that there, and you see it gives you a little Picatinny rail. This allows you to attach small red dots. You can have the pillared weaver like this, the MRS, or you can mount any of these bases, some of which are very, very nice actually. I didn't use these bases for a long time, but something like the cross-slot mount base for the delta point scope allows you to mount this little delta point thing here, and I really, really like this. I've fallen in love with this guy. This thing's super, super nice to use. But anyway, this is a slightly cheaper option. Now, as you can see, you didn't actually have to replace the receiver cover, this cover here, to get a rail. You can just attach it to this little point here, and that's it. That's basically it. That's the first way of doing it. It's nice and easy if you're just wanting to look at getting a red dot on your gun. The next way is this dovetail mount that I've been talking about the whole time. So here you can see this little line there, and there's this mounting port here, which is on the 103 that we talked about previously. So here you can attach really a multitude of things. You can either attach something like, close range like the Cobra. like this one, or the PSO if you want to go for something a little bit longer range. Alternatively, you could attach one of these. There's like a mounting platform that you can attach on the side, and then you can use really any of the other scopes or optics that you like. So you can put pretty much anything on this. So this is really giving you a Picatinny rail. You do get a little height over bore effect here. So it raises up very slightly from the gun, but it's not really a big deal if you choose the right mount. Some of them are quite high. So if you look at the Pillad, for example, and that one is quite a lot higher over the top of the weapon. So the higher it goes, the more difference you can have between where your gun is actually firing and where the eye of your PMC is looking through the scope, and that's going to cause a difference between where you're aiming at and where you think you're aiming at through the scope. So there's just one thing to bear in mind. The final way is the way that people normally do it if they don't really know how to make it work properly. This is the way that kind of comes naturally for most people. You can replace the receiver with something. So you remember that you have to remove the rear sight before you do this. Now you can replace the rear cover with something like the Academia Bastion, which is really the one that everybody uses in Tarkov all the time. This has actually been buffed slightly. This used to give negative accuracy and used to not be very good on ergonomics, and now it's actually pretty decent. So when you replace this, you see you get full length Picatinny. This is super easy. Then you can attach red dots and all sorts of other things on here if you want. And that's normally where I see people doing this, right? So if you want a big scope, like, you know, Bravo, Hammer, some kind of 4 times an LCAN, whatever, then this is a good option to be able to do it. If you're just trying to attach a red dot, this is something that I see people doing where they buy this Bastion, but you don't really need to because you can do this TTO1 thing that I mentioned before. So that's kind of the 3 ways broadly to actually attach scopes to these different guns. And you can do the TTO1 on all of them, you can do the Bastion on all of them, and then the dovetail is intrinsic to the weapons. There's no, if the weapon doesn't have a dovetail, like the AKM and the AKMS, they don't have a dovetail and there's no way of getting them on. That's intrinsic to the gun itself. So that comes with the weapon. You have to buy one with it. Otherwise, you're screwed and you just can't get it. Okay, so next up, we're basically going to look at the cheapest build that you can make. Now, one useful thing that I use on the flea market is if you're linked searching something, you can click on the category and it will show you every single gun all together in one big long list. And this is quite useful to stop you having to flick between different things. So you can aggregate searches together. So you can see in here, I have the AKMS and the AKMSN both in one list. Now, when you're buying AKMSs of any kind, either the S or the N, just make sure that you do actually get the folding stock. Some people will sell this folding stock separately and then sell the gun without it, and that's extremely annoying because there's not any way of getting this from the traders. The traders don't sell this folding stock, which is a real pain. So just make sure that you're actually getting folding stock with it when you buy one of these. Now, given the choice between the AKMS and the AKMSN, given what we were talking about with the dovetail, if they're the same price or very similar to being the same price, I'd pretty much always just go with the MSN because that gives you the option of using the PSO or the EKP or something on the dovetail mount, and it means you don't actually have to buy anything separate if you want to mount a scope onto it. So let's have a look at the MSN for our minimum viable build. You can use these guns as stock, obviously, but they're not going to be very good. The AK-762s have very, very high recoil, and that's almost been kind of made worse in this patch. You can't get them down to as low as you could, but we'll see that a bit later. So if we go and have a look at the AKMSN, the minimum kinds of mods that I would really want to apply, some stuff that people should always be doing. Now, do note that you do need Prapor 2 to make some of these work. So you do need some of the traders at level 2. The best one, really, is the butt pad that you can get. Now, this thing is so good. So let's have just a quick look before I add that on at what our overall recoil is. So right now, it's 129 with 45 ergo. If we apply this pad, that takes us down to 119. Now, the pad is very cheap, and it's always worth doing. In terms of the muzzles, the one that I really like is this Dynacomp, the Spike Tactical Dynacomp, which again, it's very cheap for what it does. So if we pop that on, and that gets us down to 105. So we're still not down below 100 recoil. So, you know, we're talking super budget here. This thing's not going to be a laser by any stretch of the imagination. In order to improve this a little bit, we're going to want to look at some handguards. Now, in my opinion, the handguard situation is quite dire at the moment. It's very difficult to get one that's quite good. Anything with 3% recoil reduction and above is quite expensive. So, you know, you have some of these ones like the Hex, CMRD, which is the best in slot, or like X47, but they're all basically 20 grand or above, which is quite difficult. So out of the ones that are 2%, you might want to pick one of those, but for a super budget build, 2% recoil is really not going to make or break what we're doing here, right? So one that has 2% on it is like the CAA, for example. So you can see in the vertical recoil, that's actually only going to change this recoil by 4. And so what are we really paying for? It doesn't really seem much point. However, if you did want to do something like adding a foregrip or a laser, but wanted to do it really, really easily and really cheaply, one that is actually quite a good option is the AK-100 series foregrip, which I've used from time to time. The foregrips that you might want to add to this are, again, they're probably still a bit too much. If you're not just looking for something that's only got ergonomics, which I think is probably just a waste of money, to be honest. But what this thing does actually have is a side slot here, which allows you to add something like the NC Star Tactical Blue. So you can get a blue laser on your extremely budget AK. This is one option if you're thinking about adding a flashlight or a laser or something to this extreme budget build. Now, I said I'm not really a fan of the low-level handguards just because they don't really do enough for the price, but one that I really would think about looking at before you try and go into this is if you have Mechanic 2 and you can buy the rail, right, what we're going to do is we're going to find some parts, and again, we're going to use the power of linked searches. So here, once you're in the parts finder, you can actually linked search onto the flea market and then get back out into our preset again. So what we're going to do is look at the AKM gas tube, link search that, because that's going to show us all the handguards that will fit onto this particular gas tube. So we go down into weapons, parts and mods, into vital parts, and into handguards. We have a massive list. One of the reasons why this list is so big is because here, these ones are all the same. So there's the MOE AKM handguard. Now this is the black version, which is very expensive from Skier because, you know, black is tactical, obviously. But all of these have -2% recoil and +10 ergonomics, which is actually really good. This ergonomics value is really good for a 2% recoil handguard. The other ones, if we just have a quick look at those here, are things like the CAA, which is one obvious choice, that's -2 and +7. Then we have the Trax, which I think is the worst of these three, with -2 and +6. And then we have the B10M has +9. So B10M is the best with +9 and -2. This one's got +6, this one's got +7. So compared to these, this MOE AKM handguard is actually really good with -2 and +10. Now, the critical thing about this is that yes, people buy the black one, but there are loads of different ones here. So you've got the black one, the flat dark earth one, you've got this other flat dark earth one, a plum version, stealth grey. There's just so many. So as you can see, some of the prices are actually quite low. So this one here, this Magpul stealth grey version, is only 7,500. You basically can flick through, and because people pick these up all the time, they're actually quite frequent drops in the world in loot spawns. So you see these quite often. So as you flick through, you'll see that the prices are, you know, fluctuating for them. You might get a really good bargain. Sometimes they're selling all the way down to for like 6,000, 7,000 rubles, something like that. Especially in the funny colors. People don't really like using the beige light colors. Now the one catch about this is that you need to be able to use a particular rail, which you need from Mechanic 2. If you don't have Mechanic 2, it'll be extremely expensive on the flea market. But what that is this, the Magpul M-Lock 4.1 inch guide. So it's cheap from him, 1.7, but yeah, they're quite rare in the world. Now that we've decided that we're going to use this though, if I press ESC, it takes me straight back to the preset. So if you can buy that and you want to give it a go, say, okay, well, we get one of these flat dark earth versions and we've got the 4.1 inch Magpul guide, then what we can do is we can apply other foregrips to this instead. Now the one that I quite like is the RK4 because this one seems to have slipped through the cracks in the rebalancing and is a -2%, which you can get at Skier 2, which is pretty cool. Now the one other thing that I would note, these ones, Magpul AFG Grip FDE and the like, if we go back into find parts and look at this M-Lock thing, so let's go linked search on this, we're going to bring up all of the foregrips. Again, these ones come in like a bunch of different colors. Now, they're cheap on the trader, but as you can see, like this FG one, you can buy this for 6,000. Or like this one's really expensive because this is used for one of the gunsmith tasks, and this is 10k because it's the black one. But what you can do is you can flick around between these and have a little look and see if there's any that are cheap. You know, I always end up getting this one, I think the green one, because it's so cheap. So between the two, you could really end up spending like 1.7 on the rail, 6,500 say on this foregrip, and then 7,000 on the handguard. So you're actually there getting, you know, 4% recoil reduction and some decent ergonomics for about 15k, which is really good. That's honestly really good. So using these, we've actually got an okay ergo now. It's like 56, and our vertical recoil is coming down to 298. This actually isn't too bad. This is getting better, and this is on the AKM SN, so we don't really have much else that we can do with this, to be honest. You can make this better, and you can add the Dynacomp on the front. There's one other point that I would note. If you change the dust cover over to the Bastion, you do actually get another recoil reduction here, but it's only another 2 points. It's a 1%er, so it's really not that big a deal. You'd only really want to do that if you are actually going to use a scope and you want it directly attached here. But as we said before, we bought the N version, so we can actually use a PSO. Always make sure that you do actually have a cover, because you lose a lot of ergo for not having one. There's like a few different options in order to make a budget build. As you can see, this is really not getting much better than 98 unless you start doing some serious stuff to it. So bear in mind that this is probably going to be best suited semi-auto or really, really close up, using that full auto if you're, you know, in a building or something, or you're really under the cosh. But most of the time, this is going to perform very similarly to an SKS with a 30 round AK mag on it, right? So you're going to slap some kind of AK mag on this thing and then be using it semi-auto over range, or even with a red dot, you probably want to be semi-auto over about 50 meters, just because the recoil on this is going to be crazy otherwise. Now, in terms of meta builds, I didn't really want to make another AKM low recoil video because I don't really think it's worth it anymore. Honestly, I think that they've completely screwed up the AKM. So I'm going to show you what I mean. So let's just load up the AKM stock preset. Let's do the AKM N at least, because then we have that extra option here. So what they've done to this is the best muzzle device that you can use is this JMac RRD, which I'm going to bring the stats back open. So this thing starts without, if we just use the default, this is going to have 124 vertical recoil. Now, this RRD, you can only buy this one for the AKM and mechanic level 4. But it is actually extremely good value. I'm actually not quite level 40 yet, so if we go to find parts, you'll see I can't actually get it. But if we remove the trader's mark from here, you can see it's on the flea market for an awful lot of money, but we can filter by item for it and go and see how much it's going to be. And it is only 14,500 for what it does. It's actually very, very good. So this thing is minus 16% recoil, which is pretty extreme, and it takes us from the 125-ish down to 100 pretty much instantly. Now, the stock that used to be really good on this was the Zhukov stock, and this was really the basis around the Meta AKM and why it was so good. But unfortunately now you can see we're really not changing the recoil by that much at all. We're only going down to 89 by putting this on, and I was quite disappointed to see this, because this is really what this was for. You know, if you go and find the parts for this thing, the Zhukov it's not cheap. It's like 22,000 rubles or something from Peacekeeper, but with 51 ergo and 89 with it, the one thing that surprised me a lot is that if you change over back to the polymer stock and add the butt pad, you get to 44 ergo and 91 recoil. So on recoil, it's really not that much different, just adding the butt pad to the base gun. I find this balancing decision very strange. This is where it's all changed. So what we need to do now, add this ME4 adapter for AKs. Is not as good as is not as good as using this buffer tube here, because what this ME4 adapter allows you to do on the stock is we can access all of these, which is normally for the AR-15s and that kind of gun, for M4s, etc. Now, usually we'd use the SI Advanced, but in this particular build, we actually get to use the Mesa Tactical Crosshair, which is 6% reduction just for using this, as opposed to the 4 from the Advanced tube. So I'm going to use that Mesa. And then from here, we get to use all the stocks. And we saw in my previous video about the Vector, we went and had a look at all of these different ones. In terms of the stock I think you should actually use for real builds, I think, again, it should be these MOE stocks. They come in all different colors. It means that sometimes you can get a good discount on them. And with the rubber back pad, it's very, very decent. But in terms of pure minimum recoil, the thing that you want to be using is the PRS Gen 3. So you can see the difference in the stats here. So you lose 7 ergonomics and for 2 less recoil, which I personally don't think is worth it, but let's just see where this ends up getting to. Now, the other things that we can do have stayed the same, so this is no different to the way it used to be. So if we go and have a look at the handguards, I said that this thing was best in slot, the CMRD, it still is, and then we have to add one of the 6-inch guides for the key mod, and then the RK2, which again is still the best in slot vertical foregrip that you can get, but it loses you ergonomics. The very final part of this, as I mentioned before, actually this B33 gives you the most reduction for recoil of all of the covers, but you can't use it with really any handguard. There's only 2 handguards that you can use it with, and those are not best in slot, and so that combination is not worth it. So what we can do is we can add the Bastion on here, which gives us our last little bit of recoil reduction and takes us to 66. Now, in my opinion, 66 really is not very good. This is the best possible recoil reducing build that you can make, and the gun is still at 66. That means it's going to perform like a dog over pretty much any distance if you try to full auto somebody. I know Battlestate are trying to remove the full auto meta, but it's not really gone from the M4s and the HKs, to be honest with you. And with the Vector, again, it's not gone at all. And the rounds for the Vector are very, very good, and the rounds for AR-15 is also very good. I think that this has kind of killed the AKM, to be honest. I was quite borderline about the AKM previously anyway, because of the slow rate of fire and the fact that you couldn't get any better bullets than BP. BP's okay, but it's not, it's not incredible. And because of this, with the 66 recoil, I just don't think this gun is really usable at the top levels of play anymore. I mean, I don't think you can even pretend that it's good. Some people are going to probably hate me for that, but I was really borderline about it, as I said, and now I just can't see myself ever using this weapon, to be honest with you. So let's compare and contrast this with the AK-103. Now, I think this is really what the rebalancing was supposed to be for, was to try and change this a little bit and move these things a bit close together. Now, one interesting thing that you'll see right off the bat is that the stock build for the 103 has 106 recoil, which is a lot better than the AKM's 120 something recoil to start with. And one thing that drives that is actually just the default compensator has 8% recoil reduction on it rather than 5, which is an interesting choice. So it means that off the bat, the AK-103 is better. However, when we go through and change everything, right? Again, we're going to use the JMAC RRD for this build, but what you should notice is that this is the AK-74 type thread RRD, which is different to the one on the AKM. So we're going to use that. Let's take off the magazine for a second. I'm going to leave the pistol grip as is for now. In terms of stocks, the best for this, now that they've done the changes that they've made, is basically you're going to use the PT lock and you're going to use the PT3. That's the best way, and it's easy as well. It's easy. You can't make it any better using any of these buffer tubes. So the RPK buffer tube is better than the other one, but even if you attach the best that you can't actually attach the PRS to this one. If you attach this, you get to 84, whereas if you use the PT and the PT3, then you get to 82. So that is actually slightly better. Same as with the other gun, we're going to use the CMRD and we're going to use the strike rail as well, and then the RK2 underneath. And that's it, right? Other than the Bastion, that's it. And again, that gets us to 66. But this gets us 62 ergonomics instead. So both weapons, the 103 and the AKM, they both get down to 66 recoil. However, the AK-103 has much higher ergonomics than the AKM did. Now, the other point that I want to note here is that this method of attaching the stock is way easier than doing the ME4 adapter and then the Mesa Cross and then the PRS stock on there, which loses you a ton of ergonomics. This is way easier. You literally just get this little lock and then attach the PT3. And the other point that I noted about before, about this RRD, is quite interesting because if we go and have a look at this one here, so this is actually only 10,000, and this is really good. For 15% recoil reduction, this is really, really good. And this comes from Mechanic, and so I said before, I don't actually have Mechanic 4 yet because I'm not level 40, but I do have Mechanic 3, and I can buy this one. So you can actually make the Meta 103 earlier. It's available at an earlier trade level than the one for the AKM, which I find quite fascinating. So really, I think this is kind of the meta build. If you're going to be running these 762 AKs, this is really the one that you're going to want, or like a modified version of this. You might want to change the foregrip over so you don't lose quite as much ergonomics. So you could use, the canted version or something, so you get up to like 67. But again, with the 68 recoil, I just don't see myself really using this gun, to be honest. It's honestly a real shame. So let's just touch on a few other bits that I wanted to mention, which didn't really fit into the discussion that we were talking about before. So muzzles, in terms of these guys, outside of the Dynacomp, which is the very cheapest, and the RRD, which is the one that gives you the greatest amount of recoil reduction, I don't think it's really worth messing around with the others in between, and that goes for the 103 and the AKM as well. So between the Dynacomp and the RRD, these are both really, really good value. The ones in between, you're just kind of paying more for a little bit of recoil reduction, potentially, and really you just want to jump up to the RRD if you can, and if you can't buy that, then I just stick with the Dynacomp. I just don't think it's going to make enough difference. Next, in terms of suppressors, yes, you can suppress these weapons. If you got to do it for Punisher as well, you actually have to. If you want to suppress the weapon, you're really just going to throw the stats out of the window. So you're making the decision between, do I want a gun that performs in a nicer way, or do I want the gun to be silent? That's really the choice that you're making. So if we hover over a couple of these, so we lose 15 ergo for this one, and add 9 recoil to this, -18 and +8, -15 and +11, -14 and +10. So really there's not a, some of them are better than others, but you kind of just scuff the weapon if you really choose any of these. I mean, the one that decreases the recoil benefits the most is the PBS. You still end up with 76 recoil using this particular setup. I mean, if we flick this back to the minimum recoil version, which is the RK2, you still end up with 74 recoil if you're using a suppressor, which is pretty bad, honestly. It's not very good. So you're really having to make a big compromise between recoil, ergonomics, and whether you want to be suppressed or not. In terms of magazines, you can really use whichever one that you want, to be honest, but if you're using 30 rounders, which given the fire rate of this whole platform, I tend to find 30 rounders is just fine. If we have a look at some of the ergonomics disadvantages that you can get for some of the drums, this guy removes 26 ergo. This one here is better with -18, and then this 50 rounder is -15. The one that I tend to always use is this, which is the aluminium magazine. That actually only removes 1 ergonomics and is really cheap from Prapor. The 103 mag actually removes -3, and so I tend to use these aluminium ones. You find them on scavs fairly often, and if we go and find parts, yeah, you can get them from Prapor for like 3,500 rubles. I think it's only 1k rubles more than the basic one anyway, so you may as well run that. The final thing is on pistol grips here. I often tend to just use the saw. The saw you can pick up once you've got the trader levels for it at $43 from Peacekeeper, which I think is actually really, really decent. There's a good 6 above this version of the AK pistol grip, and it's a good 5 against the polymer one. Now the best in slot, there are 3 which all have the same. So you've got the RK3, which gives you 1 more than the saw does. You've got the Scorpius, the Aeronox Scorpius, and you've also got the US Palm. Now, the US Palm is actually the best in slot here because, as you can see, if we attach this and we hover over some of the others, the Scorpius is very slightly higher in weight, as is the RK3, and that actually has it makes a difference on the overall weight of the gun, but really, it's kind of immaterial between them. I'm not sure if you'll really notice. Between any of these 3, those are going to be the best in slot ones. For 1 less ergonomics, you can get the saw, because if we have a look at how much this costs, this is 70 from Peacekeeper, so it's not really that much, but in an overall sense, but it's kind of like, half again as much. So I tend to use the saw an awful lot because I think it is quite good value. So if I was going to be running an AK in raid for 7.62, I'd be using an AK-103 if at all possible, and I'd be using the budget build that we talked before. So we're talking about the spike, and we're talking about literally just putting on a butt pad onto the stock, and that's going to give you something that's a little bit better, but you really haven't spent much money on it. If I've got some decent trader levels, then I would consider using the RRD rather than using this CMDR. We could probably pick up one of these Magpul MOEs fairly cheap, a 4-inch here, and then one of these Magpul grips, a saw grip here, and you can use the PT3 if you want. That's probably okay, and this gives you like 75 ergonomics and 73 recoil. Now I appreciate the biggest problem here is getting this Mechanic 3 muzzle device, which is the biggest problem. If you carry and just replace that over with the Dynacomp, that gets you to 80. But really, the RRD is such good value for what it is. As the best in slot, it's actually an amazing muzzle device. Honestly, it's really, really good. Now, again, if you want to save a bit more money, rather than going for 75 and 73, just because of the way that they've rebalanced these stocks now, you can just use the basic stock and use a butt pad on it. That gives you 70 and 77. Like, the basic stock really isn't that bad. With the butt pad, it makes it pretty good. And then from there, you can just stick on whatever optic you want. So you can use the Cobra, which is an interesting one these days. I actually quite like the Cobra sight. This gives you -2 ergonomics, but then if you put the shade on, it gives you +3. So you actually gain 1 ergonomics overall if you use the Cobra on the Bastion here like this. But really, you could use any scope that you like. You can pretty much put anything on here. You can use the rings, and you can put in one of the massive optics if you like the Voodoo, or whatever you want to do. So it's completely flexible. I mean, this is probably the build that I would run if I was going to run an AKM. As I said before, I'm not sure if I would anymore, just given the changes that they've made, but I think this is probably okay, because I just don't think it's worth paying for all of the meta parts, to be honest with you. If you're only going to get down to 66 recoil, is that really going to make a big difference between 77 and 66? You probably pay double the price for all of those pieces, and here at least we have some decent ergonomics. So I think that the AK-103 is really going to turn into much more of like a DMR in this patch. Ever since they've changed this, it was never the lowest recoil laser beam, even in the previous patches. But there was, I did a video last time about the Meta AKM, and it was a lot better than this, and it was easier to spray people down with it, which I guess Battlestate don't really want. And so that's just kind of changed the role of the weapon. So it's still perfectly usable with BP rounds in it, but you just have to be mindful that you're not going to get it down to the level that it used to be. So this has been useful for you guys. I really wanted to do something that was a bit more freeform and just to break down into the minutiae of all the changes and all the things that I think are different now in 12.9 versus the way they used to be, and how the budget build hasn't really changed, but the meta build is now quite different. So as always, please do consider dropping a like and a sub if you found my content useful. You can also follow me on Twitter and Twitch to catch me when I'm live. Until then, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.